Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be doing my predictions for the 2025 F1 grid. So we have quite a few drivers who have already been confirmed for seats for 2026. All of them are in 2025. All of them have been written on the board here. A couple new ones, of course. We've had Hamilton in February. We had Hulkenberg, I believe, in April. We got Alonso and Albon as well. And besides that, the other drivers already had a contract. So we're going to go through one by one and talk about each of the teams on the board. I have two different grids kind of in my head. In black, we have the grid that I think is most likely going to happen for next year. And then in red, we have the one that I would like to see. Still realistic. It's not anything crazy. It's not like, Verstappen going to Aston Martin and Tsunoda driving for Mercedes, anything like that. I think it's still pretty realistic, but there are quite a few differences between the two. So I think at this point in the driver's market, Red Bull is really holding the key to things. And for Red Bull, they have a bunch of options. They could choose to keep Sergio Perez for next year. They could choose to bring in another driver. That could be a driver from their junior team, Daniel Ricciardo or Yuki Tsunoda, or they could bring in another driver from outside of Red Bull, like they did when they brought Perez in 2021. And of course, Carlos Sainz has been a guy who's been connected with Red Bull. He, of course, was a Red Bull junior back in the day. And I do think he would be a very interesting option. However, that being said, I think what's going to happen is Red Bull are going to choose to go with Sergio Perez. My reasons for this is that I feel like, based on the rumors that have been coming out the last couple of weeks, it really feels like they're leaning towards keeping Perez for the next year or so. On top of that, they know that Perez works well and he's happy to work as a number 2 driver to Verstappen, and he already is, well embedded within that team. And we know that there's been so much turmoil off track with Red Bull this year. I think the last thing they want is to have two drivers that are potentially at loggerheads with each other, causing even more problems for the team behind the scenes. So I think that in that respect, keeping Verstappen, keeping Perez together, a known quantity, is the best way for them to do things. That being said, I think there is risk even this year with keeping Perez, I think reality is amongst the drivers in the top teams, I do think he is the weakest of those drivers, so I do think it puts Red Bull at risk of potentially losing the Constructors' Championship when they have probably the best car. I think this year it's not really much of a question. They do have the best car, but perhaps come next year, if we have another 2021-like situation against, say, Ferrari, or they have Leclerc and Hamilton, I think it would be quite difficult for Red Bull to win the Constructors in that kind of situation. Other drivers, I think, Yuki Tsunoda, I think has been done a really good job so far at RB. I think I kind of understand why they wouldn't want to bring him in. The last couple drivers they brought in from the junior team have not really worked out in Albon and Gasly. So I do think there would be a degree of risk in that move, despite how well he's performed. And we do know that teams that are at the top of the standings, the Constructors' Championship, are generally much more conservative with their driver lineup than teams a bit lower down. We can see this just with Red Bull. Of course, when Red Bull won 4 consecutive championships at the beginning of the 2010s, they kept Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber for all 4 years, despite the fact that Mark Webber was arguably kind of past it those last 2 years. And again, we saw it at Mercedes. They kept Hamilton and Bottas all those years that they won, and it was only really at the very end that they eventually swapped Bottas for Russell. And with Red Bull, we know that when they're second, third, fourth in the constructors, they're willing to chop and change drivers like no tomorrow. But so I think in that respect, because of just looking at history and looking at how things all are playing out, I think I'm going to keep Perez at Red Bull. Now, despite the fact that I've talked about that one seat for almost 4 minutes now, I think the other drivers' seats will be a bit quicker. Now, I think after that, I think it's logical to talk about RB and decide what they're going to do. Assuming they keep Verstappen and Perez, it really leaves 3 potential drivers for 2 seats. That's Daniel Ricciardo, Yuki Tsunoda, and Liam Lawson. And for the red grid, or the black grid, I'm going to do this. I'm going to keep the same lineup, Ricciardo and Tsunoda, for 2025. I mentioned this in my video a couple days ago, but for Ricciardo, I really think that a big reason why there's so few questions about him potentially losing his seat, despite the fact that the gaps between himself and Tsunoda are honestly not that different than the gaps between De Vries and Tsunoda. Is the fact that I do think that a large part of the massive sponsorship deal that RB was able to make with Visa and Cash App were hinged on Ricciardo being in that team. And I do think, it's kind of unfortunate to say that talking about Ricciardo as a paid driver, but I really think that because of those two sponsorship agreements, I think there's a very, very low likelihood that he would be dropped entirely from the team for 2025. Now for Tsunoda, I think the reality is we know that he kind of has dual commitments between Honda and Red Bull. For 2025 at least, the RB will still be using Honda engines, so I think it does make sense in a way to keep Tsunoda for that year to help to keep Honda happy. Now, I think once we've gotten Red Bull out of the way, I think the next driver we really need to talk about is Carlos Sainz. We know he's probably the best remaining driver on the market. There are, realistically not that many great seats available. I think I think where he's going to end up is going to be Sauber. Now, for Sainz, we know that he's been given a really big offer from Sauber/Audi for 2025. They reportedly had a deadline of May 31st for that. That being said, I really doubt that deadline actually existed, and it was more just to try to put pressure on Sainz to try to make a deal as quickly as possible, despite the fact that we know that that Audi seat is probably not the best possible one from the ones available, including the Red Bull seat. That being said, it will be a works engine, it will be Audi, a name with a huge name backing, huge weight in terms of motorsport heritage. And we know that between Sainz and Sainz's father, Carlos Sainz Sr., we do know that there is some connection there between Audi and the Sainz name. I think for Sauber, it would be a great lineup to have Hülkenberg and Sainz, the 2018 Renault lineup, and I think it would be a really good start for their project. Similar to the Rosberg-Schumacher lineup that Mercedes had in 2010, I think it would be a really strong lineup that would really help them get off the ground for those first 2 or 3 years. That being said, for Sainz, I do think it's a bit of a consolation prize. We know he's at the peak of his career at this point, and we know you never know how long that will last. And drivers are always trying to be in the best seats possible in the short term for those exact reasons. And I think for the Audi project, I think realistically they're not going to be competitive until 2028 at the earliest. So even then, that's still 4 years from now, and you don't know where Sainz will be. You don't know how the driver market will look at that time. So I think going from there, I think there's a couple realistic places we can go. I think the next place I'm going to go is Mercedes. Now for Mercedes, it's actually been quite quiet recently, and I think the reality is that I think there's only one driver who's really going to be in that seat for next year, and I don't think there's a ton of other options for Mercedes, and that is Kimi Andrea Antonelli, current Formula 2 driver. Now, I do know he is 6th in Formula 2 in the Formula 2 standings at the moment. I do know he has not gotten a single pole position. He does not have a single podium either to his name, and that is something that I do think is a legit worry at this stage. That being said, we do remember what happened in 2014, 2015, where basically Mercedes were trying to get signed a young Dutchman, Max Verstappen, to their junior team, and they couldn't offer him an F1 seat right away. Red Bull swoop in, offer him a Toro Rosso seat for 2015, and the rest is history. I do think to this day, Toto Wolff kind of really has a lot of regrets about how that played out. And I think because this young kid, Kimi Antonelli, who's basically arguably in some ways the most promising driver coming up to the junior series since Verstappen did about this time 10 years ago, that they don't want to make the same mistake twice. And I think because of that, the reason why talks on the driver market with respect to Mercedes have been so quiet recently is because they're basically reserving that seat for him until it gets to a point where they decide that he needs more time in Formula 2 before promoting him. And I think as long as he keeps improving the way he has. I've watched every F2 race this season, and he's definitely improved. At this point, I would say he's top 6, top 8 driver on the grid right now. Qualifying's really good. Race pace, I think, is a little bit of a struggle with the Pirelli tires. Maybe not as good, but it's getting a lot better, and it was a lot better in Monaco, despite the fact that it was very, very hard to overtake there. And there's definitely signs where there's a lot of progress. Of course, now that we're going to the European rounds, these are tracks that he knows better than the ones that we started the season with. I think all those things combined. If he finishes top 3 in the championship as a rookie or after skipping Formula 3, I think there's no way that he will not be in that Mercedes seat in 2025. And given where Mercedes are right now, 4th in the Constructors' Championship, they're basically in the position that Red Bull were back in the mid-2000s or mid-2010s, where they could afford to take more risks with their driver lineup. So I think for those reasons, Russell and Antonelli is my predicted driver lineup for Mercedes for 2025. All right, now let's see, where should we go? So actually, let's go back over here to Sauber. So Sauber, 2 drivers, Bottas and Zhou at the moment, and of course I have them I predicted that they will completely change their driver lineup for 25. That leaves their 2 drivers looking for seats for 2025. Now, Williams. For Williams, I think that there are 2 drivers right now. Of course, Albon will continue to drive for them for 2025, and of course, then that leaves Logan Sargeant. I talked about this again and again. I talked about this in my video 2 days ago. Sargeant has improved from his rookie season. All the stats indicate that, but I don't think he's improved enough, and I don't think Williams think he's improved enough either. Based on all of those things together, I really think Sargeant is going to be out of F1 at the end of 2024. This will be his last year in F1, even if you can potentially link him with some of the other seats available. I think Alpine, no. Aston Martin, no. Haas, American driver, American team, maybe, but I don't think that he's really shown enough that another team would really want to pick him up. So I think, unfortunately for him and for his fans, I have Sargeant being out of Formula 1 at the end of 24. Now, who do I have going back there replacing him? Now, there's no other drivers in the Williams Junior team that I think are really ready to step up to Formula 1 for 2025. So I do think that they will try to pick up a more experienced driver. They haven't really had a lineup since 2016, arguably, where they've had 2 really strong drivers when they had Bottas and Massa. So I do think it's kind of a step, a chance for them to kind of build a really solid driver lineup, one that they know will not be an issue if they're in a tight fight with other teams in the Constructors' Championship. And so for those reasons, I think they're going to go to a driver who they actually have previous experience with in Valtteri Bottas. Now for Bottas, his season's been a bit up and down. Qualifying's been very strong, out-qualified Zhou every single race, and for those reasons, I think between that and the fact that we know he's a very solid driver, a great team player, he worked very well at Mercedes. From all accounts, he's done a pretty good job at Sauber as well, despite the fact that the cars has had its struggles. I think he would be a really good fit at Williams, a team that he knows, and I think it would be a good landing spot for him, having that familiar environment. So that's my predicted lineup for Williams. Now, I think we're just going to get this out of the way. For Aston Martin, it's going to be Alonso and Stroll. Don't really need to say a whole lot more than that. Now, that leaves us with 2 teams left in Alpine and Haas. I'm going to do 1 driver each for each of the remaining teams, and then we're going to talk about the other seat. So, we're going to do we're going to do Alpine first. So for Alpine, I am predicting my black bracket. I'm predicting Gasly and Ocon will be the drivers for 2025. So I know we're very boring, but I do think that at the end of the day, Alpine, because of where they're sitting in the Constructors' Championship, I do think that there aren't going to be a ton of drivers that are going to be looking at Alpine as a realistic option for the next couple of years. That being said, we do know about all the turmoil that's gone on internally with the team, especially after what happened at Monaco with Ocon basically crashing into Gasly, trying to overtake him at Portier. That being said, I do think that they're going to figure out a way to keep this relationship together, and at least for 2025, I think they're going to stick with Gasly and Ocon again, just because those are the two best drivers available to them. Now that leaves us with Haas. For Haas, now before I write any names, I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about Haas, the team. So for Haas, we know they've been in F1 since 2016. They've generally been a team that prefers to have veterans. The one time they went with rookies, it didn't go so well. A lot of crashes, very slow car, basically no good results. So I think for those reasons, Gene Haas is very adverse to bringing in more rookies, more young, inexperienced drivers. But that being said, I think another thing that a lot of teams will be taking into account is that a lot of teams generally don't like to change both drivers at once. Because it makes it harder to kind of correlate things from year to year, especially when you have two new drivers who did not drive the previous year's car. I know I have Sauber here taking a completely new driver lineup, but that's a bit of a different situation as there is an ownership change from Sauber to Audi. For those reasons, I think Haas will keep Kevin Magnussen for 2025 just to give themselves some continuity. And making sure they have a driver who's been there, knows what the previous cars were like, and gives them a lot of experience. We do know that the performance on track has been questionable at times, qualifying not great, lots of wheel-to-wheel incidents, 10 penalty points, on the verge of a race ban. We know all those things, but I do think that despite all that, we know he's a good team player. We know he knows the team very well, and I think for all the reasons I just discussed, I do think he'll be sticking around for Haas for 2025. Now, joining him at Haas, I actually have Zhou Guangyu. And for the reasons I just mentioned about Gene Haas not liking rookies, I think that's why they go with Zhou. We know that Oliver Behrman has 6 F3 practice sessions with the team this year. That being said, his Formula 2 year has not gone that great. I know there's a whole lot of reasons why that's the case. Poor performance by Prema at Bahrain, kicked out of Saudi Arabia because he was driving a Ferrari, Australia, poor luck in qualifying, Imola botched pit stop after leading the feature race, Monaco, rough qualifying there and a bit of a crazy result in the feature race. So a whole lot of reasons why Behrman's F2 season has not gone to plan. That being said, I do think because of their hesitance to take rookies, because of that experience with Schumacher and Mazepin, I think that Gene Haas, and because of that Gene Haas, we know he likes money, I do think he would try to bring in a guy like Zhou, 3 years of experience, generally very not crash prone, very safe pair of hands, not the fastest, but we do know he brings some money from that Chinese market, and we do know that he's a pretty safe driver, and we kind of know what you're going to get there. Now, that's a pretty uninspiring grid, I have to admit. We only have one rookie in Antonelli, and we only have one guy out, which is Sargent. Now, I'm going to go through the grid again, but this time in red, and these are the changes I would like to see happen. I don't think they're going to happen, but this is kind of what my ideal grid would look like for 2024. Now, for Red Bull, I think I'm going to go with Verstappen and Sainz. I think it would be an upgrade for Red Bull over Perez, a bit closer, a bit more competition between the two drivers, and I do think it would be best for Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship. Now, moving on to Aston Martin, I think Stroll's time in F1 has kind of been quite mediocre, to put it bluntly. At the end of the day, he hasn't really improved a whole lot in the last 2 or 3 years. He's not going to be a world champion. He might win a race if things went perfectly to plan, if he had an absolutely crazy race. And we've already had crazy races where he could have won, but he didn't. I think for Stroll, reading the byline, at times it feels like he doesn't really want to be there. I think with Aston Martin opening a WEC program for 2025, I do think Stroll's going to end up going to WEC. We know with Aston Martin, Honda is going to be coming in as the engine supplier from 2026. So of course they would like to have their Japanese driver in that seat, and I think would be a really nice fit for both teams. I think Tsunoda would be a good improvement over Stroll in the short to medium term, and I think it would be a nice driver for the team to build around once Alonso inevitably retires in the next 2 to 3 years, I would say. And for Sonoda, I think it would be a solid upgrade over RB, a team that's a bit higher up in the Constructors' Championship, and it would be effectively a works team. Now, with that aside, I'm going to go back to RB over here. Now, for RB, I think Ricciardo's going to get another year. I know his performance hasn't been great, but I do think that there's still talent there, still a lot of potential, and I do think that he would be there for the sponsorship reasons I mentioned before, and to mentor the new rookie coming in Liam Lawson. I think an all-Antipodian lineup of Ricciardo and Lawson would be pretty strong. Probably not as weak as Ricciardo and Sonoda, but I do think Ricciardo will eventually get comfortable with this RB car. I think Lawson will be a really exciting prospect to look and see how he develops in the coming years. Moving on to Mercedes, I'm going to have Antonelli. I think he's a really exciting prospect. I'm really curious to see what he can do in Formula One. Moving over to Williams, I actually have the same lineup here. It's again Albon and Bottas. I think a really strong lineup, something I would be really excited to see. Now, we have a couple more seats left. I think we're going to go with Gasly. Now, with not Team Gasly, Alpine. For Alpine, I think that in the possibility where basically they decide that this driver lineup doesn't work at all, we know that Ocon, for his various faults, despite the fact that he's quite a good driver, has had run-ins with 3 of his past 4 teammates. He had collisions with Perez, collisions with Alonso, and now collisions with Gasly. I think Alpine will want to keep a French driver, and I do think they'll keep Gasly. At the beginning of the season, I thought it was going to be the other way around. They keep Ocon, drop Gasly, but I think Gasly's form has kind of started to turn around, and with what happened at Monaco, I think perhaps they decide that Ocon is expendable. Now, unfortunately, Alpine is not the most desirable destination at the moment, so I do think they'll take a chance on a rookie. For Alpine, that would have been, now at the beginning of the season, that would have been Victor Martins, but he's had an absolutely abysmal season in Formula 2. I don't know if his chassis is broken, but speaking of drivers who've had their chassis broken in Formula 2, I'm in my ideal grid, I would have Jack Doohan join Pierre Gasly at Alpine. First half of his second season in Formula 2 last year was a disaster. They found out that there was an issue with his car, which is why he was so slow. Second half this season, he was absolute dynamite, probably the fastest driver second half this season. I really think he's quite a good driver, and I think because of those issues in the first half of the season, that's why he couldn't compete for a championship. Otherwise, he would have been a second-year champion, which is, I think, kind of the benchmark, the borderline of where you would want drivers to be coming in. I don't think he's, a future world champion or anything, but I do think he could develop into a very solid driver. Now for Ocon, that obviously leaves him without a seat. I do think he would stick around in F1 just because we do know that there's still quite a lot of talent there, and I would actually have him going to, where do I have him going? I have him going to Sauber, joining Hulkenberg at what will become the Audi team. We know that Audi do have interest in Ocon. He was reportedly on a short list made by Audi of drivers that they were interested in. Sainz was also on that. Hulkenberg was on that, and he of course has already been signed. So I do think Hulkenberg, Ocon, not a bad lineup. That leaves us with Haas. And now for Haas, I'm going to go with a very creative lineup. I do think that Zhou is going to stick around. I think he still has a bit more to give. I know qualifying has not gone that well, but race pace has gotten a lot better. And I think, again, with the reasons I mentioned before, I think, bringing that sponsorship, bringing that money will be something that the team will like. Now, I also have Oliver Bearman, Ferrari Junior driver, really strong performance in his F1 debut in Saudi Arabia. I think he would bring something really interesting to the grid. And of course, Haas being the Ferrari customer team, I think it would be a natural fit there. There might have to be some money going Haas's way for that to work, but I do think it's an interesting lineup there. So there you go, there's my 2 grids. On my more conservative grid, we only have 1 rookie in Antonelli. More exciting lineup, the one that I would like to see. Obviously, you have 4 rookies in Antonelli, Doohan, Lawson, and Bearman. Now, of course, that leaves 4 drivers out of a seat. So you have, again, Sargent, Stroll, Magnussen, and Perez. Now for Perez, it would be maybe a bit controversial, leave him without a seat, But I do think reality is for a lot of older drivers, once they're dropped by top teams, for them they prefer to just kind of retire instead of taking a seat lower in the midfield. Or even if they do, they retire shortly after. We saw that with Mark Webber, retired in 2013, decided not to go to like a lower team. For Jenson Button, again, similar situation, I guess, although McLaren just kind of imploded as he was there. But there's lots of instances through F1 history of drivers who would prefer to kind of retire out on top instead of kind of going back to the midfield and scrapping it out and knowing that they're never really going to get to the position that they would otherwise. That being said, if Perez retired, he's had an excellent career, been a great driver for a really long time, and I don't think it's really, it's not to say that Perez would not deserve to be on the grid. I do think he would be better than certainly quite a few options, and I guess if he wanted to, I think Haas would probably pick him up over Joe, for example. So there you go. There's my silly season predictions for 2025. Quite a long video, 25 minutes at this point. I had to do a take 3 because I wasn't happy with how things went before, but there you go. Those are my predictions. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And I'll see you again for my preview for the Canadian Grand Prix coming out in a couple of days' time. Goodbye.